Well, I expect most of you know everybody sitting at this table, but I will introduce them. Furthest to my right, we have Alona Barnett. She is the chairman of the Point to Point Secretaries Association and MD of Stratford Racecourse. We are grateful that she's hosting us. Closest to my right, Peter Wright, Chief Executive of the Point to Point Authority. First on my left, Alan Hill. He is the representative of the British Hound Sports Association, formerly known as the MFHA, on the Point to Point Board, the Point to Point Authority Board. And furthest to my left, we have Nick Wilson, who is Operations Director of the Point to Point Racing Company, and he was a former Assistant Director at Weatherby's before going into retirement and doing Point to Point Racing Company. So, let's kick off with questions for our panel. Somebody must have a question.
What are the
Charles.
certificates issued this year compared with last year?
Okay.
The question is, this is for the benefit of the people who watch it on YouTube. Charles Dixie has asked how many hunter certificates have been issued in this season.
The bald answer, but doesn't tell you too much, so I will explain a bit further, is there were 1,632 hunt certificates, which is just under 5% lower than the previous year. However, and actually more important perhaps, is the number of runs per horse, which is also slightly down. So we've got we will end up with about 4,800 runs this year. And so that's slightly down from about 3.1 to just under 3. Now, two reasons for that, so it's worth noting. First one is clearly the weather. When horses tend to run in the winter was totally against us. We tended to have the spring-summer weather in February, and then we've had the winter weather in the spring. And that has caused some upset. The other aspect, and this is where the breakdown of these figures is more important, is where these horses are standing in terms of age and location. And interestingly, perhaps not surprisingly, our 4 to 5 year olds have held up well and indeed have increased slightly and are moving towards our target is generally about 500 in that category. But they're about 380 at the moment, which is up from last year and up again from the year before. The others have generally gone down since 2018, more or less in proportion to the number of horses we've lost, which is they're about 35% lower than they were. And finally, the 13 plus, interestingly, have fallen off a cliff. They're down to less than 50% of where they were, which is intriguing when we consider relations with ROR and trying to get horses back from under rules when they finish their careers. That isn't quite as we might have imagined. So that's been a very interesting statistic from this year. The other aspect of that falls out from that. There's two more things which are kind of interesting. Despite popular perception, all the way through, or the late teens, actually the horse population held by trainers of 7 plus held at 23%, absolutely regularly, despite our perception that it was increasing. This year, the figures are 30% for the trainers holding 10 plus. So a huge climb. And that's not necessarily a problem, but it does change to some extent the makeup, which is hence why we're seeing the 4 and 5 year olds. But before you all start panicking, I might add the big trainers who are in the audience today will vouch for this afterwards, but actually they have very mixed yards. So it's not a case of that they're damaging it. And I might add, Tom Ellis has had huge success this year, and congratulations to Tom for that success. But actually, the top 3 trainers this year have won fewer races than the top 3 trainers last year. So the argument that they're taking over the world doesn't exist. I might add, even with Tom's extraordinary success, he has a far lower win to horse ratio than some of the smaller trainers, like, for example, Joe O'Shea. So it's just because he's got a lot more horses. So obviously his name appears a lot. So I would like, if you could, to spread that word, because it's, I'm sure, galling for him that his success is thrown back in his face the whole time. And I know Charlie did a great thing on the podcast making the same point. But it is slightly unfair. The other thing, and I'm sorry to be slightly long-winded about this, but I think it's worth understanding this. And this is still for discussion before anyone gets cross. But the type of horse in point-to-point is the type of horse in point-to-point is threefold. You have the young horses, which may or may not stay in pointing and go on, or go on commercially. You have the traditional route, where they go up through the races. And then you have the horses, the ex-handicappers, who are coming back and running in the conditions races. And obviously, the traditional route was where all our horses, well, not all, but 80% of our horses were until the 90s. What the figures are showing at the moment is that the only part of the country which is continuing with that traditional route is the southwest. So we have in both Devon and Cornwall and Wessex, the number of runners in maidens is greater than the number of runners in conditions and open races. In the rest of the country, it's well less. And in fact, in some parts of the Midlands, it's down to about 50 to 60% only. Now, when you also consider that quite a lot of the Midlands horses are commercial horses in the maidens, you can see the problem in terms of the horses going up the ranks through restricted and intermediate. And so that's causing quite a lot of pressure and failure, and hence why we're looking at how we can help, because one way or the other, we want the traditional style of racing to continue, because we don't really see ourselves, I hope we don't, as third-tier racing, or in the Irish model, nursery racing. So, as I say, Charles, the question is, if you like, rather more complex than the specific figures. And the other point to come out of it, of course, is that because it is so varied across the regionally, there is no blueprint on this, which is the problem, and one of the reasons I travel all over the country is to talk and look at these things on the ground as well as look at the stats, because actually every part of the country thinks they're normal. Well, they're normal for their own region, but there is no such thing as normal for the whole country. So I hope that provides a bit of background.
Do any of the rest of you want to say anything answering that question? No? Move on to the next one then. Mr. Whaley-Cohen.
Thank you very much. Following on from that question, and indeed that answer, the numbers are steadily, for whatever reason, in decline, and we have to find a way of increasing them. What is the board's plan to achieve that?
I'll start on this one. There has been a joint initiative. It started at Dingley, their last meeting. Jake Exelby has been taken on by the point-to-point authority. His remit is to bring in more owners and more horses. We had a little gazebo with a big backdrop and some pop-ups, and we were encouraging people attending point-to-points to possibly get involved in a syndicate or full ownership. There wasn't much footfall on the stand, but I did hear last night that someone has joined a syndicate and they're coming to watch their horse run this evening. So things have started.
Okay, if I could take this one again, slightly patchy. Clearly, the biggest threat to pointing in the immediate future, as you say, Robert, is the reduction in horses. And there's two sides to that. Is there a lack of horses? Is there a lack of owners? There's not much point in encouraging more owners, and there's no more horses, because all you'll do is up the prices, which will again infuriate certain sections of the point-to-point world. So both those need to be worked on, and both are being worked on. As Mark said, Jake's remit is very much on this particular subject. And there's a wide-ranging aspects to that. Whether it'll end up as a holistic plan or lots and lots of separate strands is an interesting ongoing discussion at the moment between me and Jake as to what could be achieved. Jake will be presenting to the PPA board on the 5th of July on the plan, as requested. The other side of it, there's two more angles. Sorry, there are two more angles which are key to this. The first one is that it is very clear that we have continued to lose owner trainers over the past few years, and that, of course, is very disappointing. And but it's a fact of life. Now, if I'm being callous, the reality is that if I take out the owner trainers who are licensed trainers and the owner trainers who are directly supporting young jockeys or new jockeys, we're left with about 150 of them. That's all. So there isn't much further to go, is what I'm getting at. Now, that is depressing, and frankly, I'd rather grow that number and make it easier for them. But just so you're aware, I've been looking quite closely at these figures, and this comes back to most owner trainers are interested in the progressive route, and if that progressive route is not available, then they will give up. So, hence, again, why it's an important aspect. So the bottoming out's one side of it. The other side, I'd just like to say that East Anglia saw its number of horses rise this year. Now, it's just of note that East Anglia has been at the forefront of most changes in point-to-pointing to do with really farming demographics and things like that over the last 30 years, because they've had to face up to things. What's been interesting about East Anglia is it has grown in number, and the people, interestingly, are old owner trainers who have now decided to become owners, putting their horses elsewhere. And it's an interesting trend. Obviously, you've got to have an area which has enough money to do that. But certainly, I think the Midlands area, for example, which is short on horses, is beginning to look at that and wondering how they can move that forward, hence actually Dingley. So I think there's a growing realisation of the problem, Robert, and outside of just this sort of panel, and people are doing a bit more about it now.
Just so this doesn't turn into the Peter Wright show, I'm going to ask Alan, with his keeper's hat on here, to give his thoughts on that question.
I don't think there's a lot I can say that hasn't already been said. We all the time are working to bring owners into the sport. We run a syndicate in our yard. There's never a conversation of an owner coming forward to me that isn't positive back. But yes, where are people going? I don't think it helps us. We all know this in this room, that under rules that you can go and finish 6th in a race and get prize money, where we can have lower levels of prize money. I think prize money, it would help if the BHA would let us lift our levels of prize money as well, because it's costing more and more to keep a horse. And I think anyone that ignores that, I'd be very surprised about. So I think we as keepers at the moment are doing everything we can. Charles and Patrick Millington many years ago, about 10 years ago, said, should we have selling point-to-points? Well, would that encourage people to turn up at a point-to-point and buy a horse? It's a thought. This is totally as biased as a keeper, but would that be a thing that we ought to look at? Because it may have people turning up on a sunny day on a bank holiday and think, in a moment of stupidity, I'll buy a horse, but it brings another person into it. So, yeah.
And it probably does also need saying that racing under rules has got similar problems to us anyway. Lornie.
In relation to Robert's question, at Doncaster Sales the other day, a leading racehorse trainer, national hunt trainer, said to me, why don't they open up, and this is like what we've all feared for years that this was actually going to happen, why don't they open up pointing so that trainers with a licence can have runners in point-to-points? He said, because I feel that it would open it up more. He's quite a forthright person, and he said, well, pointing's going down the drain anyway, but then that's the way he thinks anyway. But it was something, I had a discussion with him about it, but what are your views on this?
Personally, I think it's happening anyway. It's sort of happening through the back door. But yes, it has been discussed at board level that maybe we do need to open it up. And if there are going to be races where people like that can come in, maybe we can frame other races at the opposite end of the spectrum, so that instead of competing against each other, people are competing against their own groups. That's my personal view.
It's just a thought, because one has to think about these things.
I think you're right, Lorne. We're back into how many people of the traditionalists are left, because the traditionalists get crossed. And I mean, I'm afraid the last 15 years is littered with examples of where we've tried to modernise and probably lost more people than we've gained in doing so. Intriguingly, actually, it turns out, because the regs are slightly wrongly written, the licensed trainers could always run in flat races. They weren't meant to be able to, but they could. And in fact, one up in the north this year, which we decided not to make a big thing about it, because otherwise everyone else would be racing in to put them in. But it was an interesting point about flat races, that whether they should be allowed to run them, because it would be a way of trying. We certainly also agree with Mark that consideration is, if you're going to do it, you might try an area. And the alternative is to try and set up certain conditions races, which we're already looking at. One of Jake, we think, low-hanging fruit. And at the moment, though, the trainer would have to own the horse himself, although we've seen the Nick Pearce model, is we're trying to get more of the NTF engaged so that they can retain staff, because retention of staff is their huge problem. Providing a pointer is actually a fairly cheap option for them. So we think this is a growth market. There's probably another 50 to 100 horses there to be had. And in fact, actually, I was rather taken aback how many licensed trainers hold a pointer this year, or hold a hunter cert this year.
Can we have the Secretaries Association view on that?
We would be supportive of initiatives, of course, that bring horses into the racing community. And we have actually had the international fixture for 5 or 6 years that has actually allowed professional trainers to run their horses there. And I can't say we've ever been knocked over in the rush. I think I'll probably count on a hand the number of professional trainers that have actually run a horse there. And just going back to the comment about owners and what can fixtures do about bringing more people into the sport, we have actually done a piece of work at looking at what fixtures should be providing for owners as a minimum. Because quite frankly, it really annoys me if, as an owner, you turn up at the fixture and you begrudgingly given a race card, and you'll be grudgingly allowed into the paddock. And I do feel there's quite a bit that fixtures can be doing to support and welcome owners onto the course. You know, there's quite a lot of simple things that we should be doing. And so that's a big piece of work that we're doing that we're going to take back to all fixtures to try and help as well.
Chairman, can I follow up on what Lorne has just said? Because I have believed for a long time, as I think Peter will know, that we should be looking seriously at the idea of licensed trainers being able to run horses in maidens and restricted, certainly in maidens, possibly unrestricted, provided they are ridden by amateur jockeys. And I had a very interesting conversation with Nick Pearce. I don't know where you are, Nick, but beforehand. I mean, I think the sort of model. Sorry, no, don't stand up. But I mean, I think the concept of helping trainers' yards, licensed trainers' yards, to give competent work riders an opportunity to ride in a race when they're not going to be able, when they're way off perhaps being a conditional, and that ties in with that as well. So I don't know where I would leave it, but I would just be interested, because when I started a very long time ago getting involved in point-to-points, I was booed out of the house for suggesting the idea that trainers would... I've forgotten I brought June with me. Sorry, or rather, she's brought me. Would this be one? And Charles has often asked this in the past. Would this be one to just have a show of hands as to whether members would consider at least that idea of licensed trainers being able to run horses in maidens and restricted, ridden by amateurs? And I'll now shut up and sit down.
Well, we're a bit of a small sample group, but yes, let's put it to the test, see what the assembled audience think of that suggestion. All those in favour? And those against? I think we are definitely in favour of that.
Could I ask a supplementary question then? For those of you who train, if this became an option, would you then take out a licence because actually you could now do your model of young horses? No. Okay, that's a relief. Thank you.
Okay, yes, Charlotte's had the microphone in her hand for quite some time now and not managed to get her question in, so let's go to Charlotte.
Going back to the point of bringing in more horses and more owners, I think it's probably widely accepted that syndication is the way forward. And I have been part of helping Hannah and Charlie put a syndicate together, and also another syndicate in the southeast for Rob Varnum. And both have been very, very successful, both in terms of owner numbers, horse winning races, fun had, and bringing new people into the sport. In the syndicate that Hannah and Charlie have, people who had never ever been to a point-to-point before. Can I ask the committee whether or not there is any mileage in having some slightly standardised approach at point-to-point meetings about issuing tickets for syndicates? I know that Peter and I have spoken personally, and it's the answer has been you have to go and speak to the local hunt. But I can tell you now that has ranged from one ticket per horse to 30 tickets per horse. Nobody's asking for sort of a crowd of 100 in a coach load coming in. But I think that one of the ways of encouraging syndicates, encourage more people, would be to be more supportive at the gate. And these are people who are then going to spend at the track. And they're people who would never have normally come in the case of Hannah and Charlie's syndicate. So they're not missing out on gate money that they would have had otherwise.
This is definitely going to go Alona's way in a moment. But before I get there, I will say there's another working group, PPORA are involved in it, trying to get point-to-points categorised into gold, bronze and silver, and gold, silver and bronze. If you are looking after your owners from the point of view of car parks, race cards, access to the paddock, tea and coffee, you'll be in the gold bracket. If you are treating them fairly surly, you will struggle to get on the bronze.
Yeah, I don't think, just expanding from Mark's, we're not going to say the Barbary International is Gold Award. We're not going down that ROA route. What we're trying to do is we're trying to encourage fixtures to look at owners and what they offer, and try to be more supportive and more encouraging. And I totally get that, we have this same situation under rules about syndication. And it is, of course, a fine balance, because if you could be a syndicate of 10 and you put £5,000 in each, you could be a syndicate of 1,000 and you've only paid £65 a year. So understandably, there has to be a balance from the owners and the syndicate leaders, runners, and the fixtures. And I say to fixtures, please try and be supportive. But if somebody comes and requests 50 badges from you, say, look, we'll give you 10 and the others can be half price, or will be at a token gesture of £5. So I think there is things that we both need to be doing, and we both need to be open in our approach as to how we handle them. Because some fixtures, yes, they do have a big crowd and they're probably a wealthy fixture and they can afford to give a lot of tickets away. But some fixtures will only have a crowd of 200, and giving away 20 or 30 tickets is quite a big deal to them. So I think it's a work in progress and something that we all need to be open-minded about. And the thing that I do hear when people approach me is if they ask me nicely for extra tickets, they're more likely to get them. If they are rude and surly and say it's my right and demand it, I'm more likely to say, actually, no, our policy is 4 tickets. So it's something that we've got to work at together, but fully, fixtures are fully aware that we need you and you need us. So it is a partnership, and it needs to be a sensible one.
If I may, it's just worth noting that this is the hottest subject in terms of phone calls into the office. And I can assure you it's equal numbers between fixture secretaries absolutely furious and incandescent with clubs coming in and photocopying tickets and all the rest of it, and because they can't get their figures to add up, and the syndicates wanting extra tickets. So possibly, as Ilona says, there's clearly a difference between winter and spring fixtures, frankly, in this respect. In the spring you want horses, in the winter you want gate. So if you're running a fixture. But I think we need to think of it laterally and try and find an alternative to just straightforward tickets being given away.
With your keeper's hat on again, Alan, your views on this?